Hi, my name is Bruce Fenton. I'm an independent ancient mysteries researcher. I want to talk to you today about something really, well, probably I'd say quite amazing. And it's called the recent out of Australia and into Africa theory of human evolution. Now, you're probably familiar with the recent out of Africa theory. Now, the quick overview is that basically around about 70,000 years ago, supposedly ancestors of modern humans, across the world, came out of Africa, East Africa specifically, moved into the Middle East, and then gradually spread across Eurasia. They ended up going to Australia, and then the final place where they made it to was the Americas, around about 15,000 years ago. Now that's the conventional model. Yeah? I'm sure you're familiar with it. It appears on nearly every article, and every video that comes out about human origins, when they're trying to explain, where did we come from, where did we start? It always starts out with this idea, around 70,000 years ago, our ancestors came out of Africa. Well, that's not necessarily true, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, the first thing you might think is, but surely isn't this absolutely proven? Because people say, well, we've got DNA evidence. We know that it's happened. Not only have we got the fossils, but this DNA says that we definitely came from them. Well, that's not really how DNA works. For the first thing, what to say is, DNA sort of tells us about relationships between people and between population groups. Right? It can also help us with dating. It can also help with understanding when particular mutations arose inside the genome. But it's not an absolute way of telling us where a person came from geographically. However, it can certainly help. But in the case of recent out of Africa, we don't actually have DNA samples that are sufficiently old enough in Africa to really confirm a presence there anyway, because the oldest African DNA that we have goes back to around about sort of 12,000 years ago or so. Certainly not 70,000 years ago. The oldest human DNA that we've actually extracted comes from Spain and a site called Cima de los Huesos. And that DNA evidence is actually from an ancestor of Neanderthals living about 430,000 years ago. So while that's very interesting to the broader human story, it doesn't really, it's not, these are not our direct ancestors. So what we're dealing with here is, sort of a complex situation where, rather than be able to say that we have, a fossil in Africa which is 70,000 years old and which has ancient DNA, we instead have a situation where much of what is said is being based on DNA evidence extracted from modern people. So, for example, a lot of the evidence for out of Africa has come from sampling of DNA from African Americans, living today. So this means we have to rely on the assumption that the ancestors of those people were definitely living in Africa 70,000 years ago. And the reason why this is because we find within this DNA from entirely modern African people that there is a haplogroup, a genetic haplogroup called the L3 group. Okay, now L3 is closely related to haplogroups M and N. And these are mitochondrial haplogroups, so they're passed on by the mother's line, maternal line. Now, M and N are considered ancestral to all Europeans and Asians. So the inference there is that M and N perhaps emerged from L3, which seems to be an African haplogroup, and that therefore, that this must be Africans that are moving out of the continent, and that there's a mutation, or two mutations, which have given rise to M and N. Now, this is an assumption, first of all. We don't know that L3 was in Africa. Now, where my argument starts in this is that, in fact, that there's no particular reason that we should believe haplogroup L3 was African. Now, the other African groups are sort of L1, L2, L4, L5, and L6. Now, those seem to be deeply African, in as much as they are not really found in other populations outside of Africa. But L3 is particularly divergent. Out of all of these these L groups, they find that this is the one that is particularly divergent to the others. So it has a separate story in some sense. Now, if we move across the world and we go across to Australia, this is where we really start to head into some really interesting territory, because the Aboriginal people happen to have some of the oldest variants of this haplogroup M, right, which is ancestral to, Asians and Europeans. And we also now have archaeological evidence from northern Australia that places humans on the continent, and this is where I am now in Australia, places humans on this continent in the north at around 65,000 to 80,000 years ago. There's also some other sites right down in the south at a place called Point Ritchie, which has potential to being an 80,000-year-old shell midden, a stack of shells that have been broken open for the shell meat and have accrued over time. So we get sort of a concretion of shells. But so if that turns out to be 80,000 years old, as has been suggested it might be, it would place humans all the way down in the south of the continent, which is really problematic, because to have got there, they have to have entered from the north, they have to have made their way all the way down to the south, and again, you're going to add on time for that to have happened, pushing back dates perhaps to 90,000 or 100,000. There's also been discoveries at a couple of sites, like where they've been looking for core samples, for example, off the coast over near the Great Barrier Reef. And there was evidence there that there'd been fire stick farming in the remote past, perhaps 120,000 years ago. And similar evidence had emerged from a place called Lake George, where they also found evidence of fire stick farming around 120,000 years ago. So this is really problematic, because if we have Africans moving out of their continent around 70,000 years ago and heading eastwards, this really doesn't fit with having people in Australia already, and well, what would have been the Sahel plate, not just Australia, because at the time it's incorporated what is today modern Papua New Guinea and also Tasmania, and so we would have had people on this larger continental plate at a possibly early time, because to have someone moving all the way from Africa down to Australia takes time. So we wouldn't expect that to happen within about 5,000 years, that they've crossed the entire Eurasian continent without stopping, without settling, for no particular reason, have raced through the continent. They've made their way down into Southeast Asia. From there, built boats, and sailed out into an ocean, not knowing really where they're going to. They can't see the landmass ahead of them. There's some small islands across what is now Indonesia, but they wouldn't know that that there was this Australasian or Sahel plate, that there was ahead of them. So they're sort of sailing into the unknown for some reason. None of that really makes good sense. Okay, that's the first thing we have to encounter. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it certainly doesn't make sense. Because you're suddenly looking for a very rapid migration, directly from Africa to Australasia, and for no really comprehensible reason. So what really is going on here? How is it that an out of Australasia kind of model would better explain the evidence that's available? Well, okay, if we just look again at this, how this has begun, and we assume that okay, we have these people down in this area, we know they're already here in the northern area of the continent, and that around about 50,000 years ago, 55,000 years ago more precisely, that they begin to move outwards and move into Southeast Asia. This will make a lot of sense, because what we find is that the Asian and European group seems to diverge away at around about that, about 55,000 years ago. They diverge away from their source population. Now, it's not clarified who that source population is. Are they the Africans? Are they the Australasians? But if we assume they're Australasians, we can see how this would work, because all of the archaeology and genetic data is pointing to an expansion that moves from Asia towards Europe, and then eventually this migration even makes its way to North Africa. And there's an incoming group that's detected in the genetics of North Africans, showing that these people have moved all the way across from basically Southeast Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, into Western Asia, into Europe, and into North Africa. Like, it's a no-brainer here then. Where are these people coming from? They're coming from the east, okay? Because why would someone come out of Africa, run around in a bizarre loop to Australasia, and then double back on themselves and head back to Africa, and all in this rapid time frame? It doesn't make sense. What makes sense is a migration that is starting from this area and spreading westwards. And we know now that we have humans here early enough to do this. We have a dating 55,000 years ago that fits very well with the evidence in Australasia. We have archaeological evidence in Southeast Asia of an early modern human presence, and also in East Asia and China. So the evidence is already there. The problem is that this doesn't really filter through to the mainstream. And then if you were to talk to any journalists, they'll say, well, why aren't we hearing about this from a leading academic? Why is it coming from someone who is in the fringes, who's an independent researcher? associated with, with ancient mysteries and sort of, I guess, what they would call pseudo-scientific topics. The reason for this really is that, firstly, academic research takes time. It's a slow progress. But secondly, there is a dogma here and a built-in belief system that, that we've already solved this story and that there is no doubt about this recent out of Africa theory. So there's no possibility of challenging it. So even though the evidence is accruing, which shows that it no longer makes sense, what has happened, instead of a revolution and a paradigm shift, is that simply they've tried to change the date slightly and say that, well, maybe these Africans moved out of the continent 80,000 years ago, maybe 90,000 years ago, and that we can explain it through this. Well, let's look at that for a moment, because I'd say that you can't. And the reason why you can't is because the genetic evidence that's being relied upon for recent out of Africa is that around 70,000 years ago, haplogroup L3 appears in the genome of modern Africans, right? So we have an absolute limit there to place any of this in Africa, which is around 70,000 years ago. Because prior to that, we have nothing. We have no genetics to support this. Okay, what we do have is some fossils, but as we've already seen, there's fossil evidence also in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So we can't simply say that because there's modern humans in parts of East or South Africa, that means it must be there. Because equally, the Chinese scientists are saying that, well, hang on, we've got really old modern human fossils here, 80,000 to 120,000 years old in caves in China. So, why couldn't it be there? So the fossil evidence alone isn't enough either. And the genetic data can only support this migration starting 70,000 years ago. And here's where we get into some really problematic territory, because let's look again at these East Africans, okay, that 70,000 years ago, they somehow developed this new haplogroup, supposedly through mutation. But what is the actual cause of this appearance of this new haplogroup? Well, I'm going to suggest that it's not a mutation at all. In fact, what we see here is interbreeding between two groups of modern humans. One group is moving from the Eurasian continent into Africa via what's called the Bab-El-Mandeb Straits, which you'll see if you look on the map. You'll see that there's a very small channel of water that separates basically the Middle East and Africa, and that that essentially that you can cross this with practically swimming across, or even on a log and paddle is a very short distance to cross. And when the sea levels were lower, it was even shorter to cross. And so 70,000 years ago, or 72,000 years ago, is a particularly important time in the history of the planet. And the reason for that is that down in Southeast Asia, there is an enormous supervolcanic eruption that goes off. It's called the Lake Toba supervolcano, right? And this devastates the local region, but also has wider consequences. The ash cloud drifts towards the northwest and begins to cover the Eurasian continent. And as it moves up into the atmosphere, it encircles the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, causing sort of global warming, well, certainly bihemeral global warming. The northern hemisphere starts to cool. It's already in an ice age. It brings also acid rain, of course, which we have then cooling, which affects the plant life, acid rain affecting the plant life. So there's trees and plants that are dying, animals that are dependent on that vegetation are dying, and of course any humans across the continent are also hugely affected by this. So you can imagine now that you've got a spreading catastrophe across Eurasia, and that humans living there are massively impacted, whereas those to the south of the equator, down in say Australasia or in South Africa, are not so impacted by this. And we know this. I mean, there's a number of studies have shown that the effects in the southern hemisphere are not so dire, that you can survive. This is why we know South African people did survive that right through this period. But let's imagine for a moment that you're trapped in say Western Asia and you're being pushed by this increasingly dire catastrophe. You're going to head towards Africa, basically. You're being pushed along towards the west and towards the south to try and escape from this disaster. Eventually you're pushed to the Bab-El-Mandeb. And so this is the point where I say that what's happened is, around 70,000 years ago, a group of these Eurasian tribal people has crossed the straits in desperation, have made their way into Africa, and there, knowing that they've got all hell at their backs, they have pushed forwards. And they have a particular advantage. And the reason for that is because we know now that the first indications of arrows, bow and arrow technologies, seem to appear in East Africa around about 70,000 years ago. Along with the change in art style and other cultural elements seem to be changing, the paints and stuff being used, there seems to be a cultural change underway. But bows and arrows are a radical technology compared to spears and hand axes. So we can see this is really important cultural transition, and it happens to match exactly with the timing of the appearance of haplogroup L3, right? And not only haplogroup L3 on the mitochondrial line, but we have the sudden appearance of a Y chromosomal or male lineage, which is known as CT, at the same time in the same place. This is very unlikely to happen by random mutation, particularly because we know that the Y chromosome mutations and the mtDNA mutations differ by a rate of around 10, like a factor of 10. So we wouldn't expect them to really coincide like this in this way. It's very unlikely that in the same place at the same time we get sudden mutations on both lineages. And not only that, but within a very short period, the mtDNA lineage then supposedly mutates again twice, giving us both M and N. I don't believe this for a moment. At this point, I think that we are going into the realms of silliness, where people are being asked to believe things that are totally unreasonable, when there's a much more reasonable solution to this. That we already have humans living across Eurasia and Australasia and in Africa, and that outside of Africa, the common lineages are L3, CT, M, N. That these people are being moved around by the climate disaster. So what we'd see, of course, down in Southeast Asia is people fleeing island Southeast Asia and heading into Australasia, onto this, this vast Sahel plate. And whereas, of course, to the west, people are fleeing down into South Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Suddenly, it all begins to make absolute sense. And you don't need any new evidence, and we don't need to ignore any of the existing evidence. This is a better fit to what we have. The problem is that at the moment, scientists in the academic community are simply either unaware of all of this information, or ignoring the information, or really don't know what to do with it, because they've got careers perhaps based on this, and they have to go into the university and lecture. They'll be in there this week lecturing on recent out of Africa. So it's a difficult situation. Do they turn around and say, we got it all wrong? Actually, no, this is a recent out of Australia and into Africa theory, and that we need to sort of rewrite the textbooks? Or do they just sort of, steamroller on and just ignore the problems that are accruing continually at the moment? In fact, we even know now that there was such a climatic disaster in the Middle East, right, that it doesn't make sense to see people going out of Africa. And that's because they've looked and they found that North Africa, even the Middle East, the Levant region, that around 70,000 years ago, there was a devastating drought, obviously associated with this climate shift. And that it's hard to see how any humans could have survived. I mean, some small number may have, but it was a devastating situation, and not one that humans would merrily walk into. So if you were in Africa, you certainly wouldn't be heading to the northeast into what is colder, drier territory, when you have essentially everything you need where you are. And this is really another area which is really causing some rethinking for some scientists, although there's been an attempt to say that, oh well, although we used to think that people were moving out to get a better environment, that maybe they were pushed out by a bad environment. So there's a tendency to try and fit whatever evidence into the existing model, instead of saying, well, look, the evidence is absolutely opposite to what we believed, and that perhaps the theory is deeply flawed. That's not happening. So what we really have is a group of people that are already down in Australasia, in this sort of Sahelian region, that are there in safety. Some of them will be people that have been pushed down there from island Southeast Asia, and maybe even mainland Southeast Asia, that have escaped from this climate shift. Then, as the climate improves, around about 60,000 years ago, some of them start to move north. They make their way into island Southeast Asia, what we call Indonesia today, slowly crossing into the mainland of Asia. And around about 55,000 years ago, this group has broken away from their sort of ancestral population to the south. And we can see this in the genetics. And that they then move northwards and split. There's a group that sort of takes over the region of East Asia and northern parts of Asia, while another group heads more to the west, perhaps along the coastlines, enters into the Middle East area, moves upwards, and eventually enters into Europe. So we have a kind of a split between two groups, of course, which today would be the Asians and the Europeans. This is a totally sensible model based absolutely on scientific evidence. So let's hope that at some point the academic community is willing to acknowledge this scenario and simply look at the evidence that I'm giving to you. But I'm hoping that you will at least understand what's being said here, and that instead of us waiting for the slow wheels to turn in academia, that the public instead embraces this new model, comes to understand that human origins, the story is very different to the one that's been repeated again and again, ad hominem, in every newspaper article, on every show, without any attempt to question this, that, that there is another very, very well supported and sensible model. And I'm going to leave that with you now, and let me know what you think. Put something in the comments, or feel free to shoot me an email. And of course, you can check out the whole argument for this in my book, which is the Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. You're very welcome to have a look at that. But hopefully, there's enough in this video that you get the idea. So thank you ever so much for listening.